And greetings to you. Joe Rubenstein here, producer and host of Real-Time 1960s. I want to thank you very much for joining me today for this portal into the past, where I document the 60s in real time with podcasts like this, with our evening news reports with audio clips and commercials of the day, as well as our daily timeline. And that timeline, along with each and every podcast, links to social media, how to reach us directly, it's all there for you on our website, realtime1960s.com. And if you love what we're doing and you want even more content, visit patreon.com/realtime1960s, support this project, and get exclusive access to members-only posts and 3 additional podcast series: White House Tapes, Special Report, and Films of the 60s. And today, we continue our journey up my ranked list of the top 10 films of 1963. On 4 previous episodes, we covered films 10 through 7, From Russia with Love, This Sporting Life, a documentary called Crisis Behind a Presidential Commitment, and The Great Escape. And today, we move on to film number 6. So without further ado, the Best of 63 at the Movies Part 5, right now. You know, this probably won't come as a shock to you, but I've seen a lot of films, from every era and every country really, dating back to the 1930s. And once in a blue moon, I'll discover an older film I'd never seen before that's really good. Saturday Night and Sunday Morning, a British New Wave film released in 1960, Albert Finney's first lead performance, is a recent example. But virtually never do I encounter an older film previously unknown to me that is truly great. But today's film, an Italian strike drama called The Organizer, is the exception that proves that rule. I had never heard of this film before this year, but everything from the exquisite black and white photography to the consistently brilliant performances by its perfectly chosen cast, the history and insights and nuanced characterizations packed into the screenplay, the editing, the music, the costumes, all these elements vault this film into true greatness, in my estimation, borderline masterpiece status, in fact. And the truth is, I could easily justify ranking The Organizer higher on my list than number 6. But Mario Monicelli, the film's gifted and criminally underappreciated director, 48 when The Organizer was released, was virtually obsessed with a specific theme or dynamic. And this may partially explain why he's underappreciated. And that is the presentation of a group of people, sometimes all men, as in the case of his groundbreaking 1958 comedy, Big Deal on Madonna Street, sometimes both sexes, as in the case of today's film, who attempt an enterprise that is beyond their reach and fail to achieve their goal. Or, to put it more simply, Monicelli's films shine a light on the inherent difficulties of collective action. And none of them, at least the 3 that I've seen, have quote-unquote happy endings. Now, whereas Big Deal on Madonna Street, which is a parody of the 1955 heist film Rafifi, is a comedy with dramatic elements, The Organizer is a drama with comedic elements. And this fusion of drama and comedy places both films in a genre that Monicelli really pioneered, called commedia all'italiana, or comedy the Italian way. A genre that really took off in the 1960s, when Vittorio De Sica directed a number of films in this genre, one of which, Yesterday, Today, and Tomorrow, won the Academy Award for Best Foreign Film in 1965. But Big Deal on Madonna Street, which really launched the career of the great Marcello Mastroianni, who plays the organizer in today's film, is generally regarded as the first entry of this new genre. Another characteristic of which, and this was borrowed from an earlier genre that emerged after World War II, called Italian neorealism, a social commentary. Although I should note, the social commentary in The Organizer deals not with the Italy of the 1960s, but of the 1890s, as it depicts the struggle of a fictional group of factory workers in the industrial city of Turin to achieve what would seem to be a modest, even too modest goal: to have their 14-hour day reduced to 13 hours. And the spark for this collective effort is an accident at the textile factory. An older worker falls asleep at his post, gets caught up in one of the machines, and loses a hand, a very common occurrence back then. So after an initial stab at confrontation with factory management fails in humiliating fashion, the workers finally decide to go on strike with the aid of the organizer of the film's title, Giuseppe Sinigalia, an activist who's been sent to Turin by a left-wing attorney in Genoa to aid the workers' cause, although the organizer is also wanted in Genoa for allegedly assaulting a policeman during a demonstration. So that's another reason why he's on the run. But what's interesting is that this organizer in almost no way fits whatever preconceived notions you may have about such a person. With his rumpled clothes, a battered hat, and round spectacles that are always falling off or being knocked off at the most inopportune times, he's almost like an absent-minded professor or artist, kind of comically bumbling in a Chaplin-esque way. But at critical moments, you do see another side to this man that explains his chosen field. The tactical thinking, the cleverness at outwitting the authorities, the ruthlessness, and the ability to deliver compelling speeches, which embolden the workers and focus them toward determined action. And Mastroianni shows off his considerable range here as an actor, as this character is worlds removed from Guido Anselmi, the creatively blocked, somewhat narcissistic film director he portrays in Fellini's 8½, which was released just 8 months before this film. Now, this film's Italian title, I Compagni, does not translate as the organizer, but rather as the comrades. Now, as to why it was mistranslated for the film's international release, I have no idea. It's actually a very common phenomenon for foreign films of this era. It may have been the fact that the word comrade had communist associations, which could have troubled the film's distributors in this country. I'm just speculating. And Monicelli, who died in 2010, was a Marxist and a self-avowed communist. But whatever the reason, this mistranslation is a little unfortunate because the true title, The Comrades, is not only more descriptive of the film's actual content, there's a certain irony to it as well. More descriptive because the role of the organizer, who doesn't show up until about 30 minutes into the film, is not the lead role, as the American title implies. There is no lead role. He is, of course, critically important, but we get to know just as much about several other characters in the film who have roughly equivalent screen time. So the title, The Organizer, is misleading, because Mastroianni does not carry the film, as he does 8½, but rather blends into a unified collective whole. Now, the irony of Monicelli's true title is that the comrades of the film often fall well short of comradeship, as the escalating pressure created by this prolonged strike leads not only to great material discomfort, but to grave doubts about this radical course of action. And as a result, there is infighting among the strikers and the constant temptation to abandon this dream of a 13-hour day, which, I mean, think about that. Hard, repetitive, dangerous manual labor from 6 a.m. to 7 p.m. every day except Sunday. And that's not what they're protesting. It's what they're seeking as an improvement. And still, the bosses totally shut them down. So that fact, which is not exaggerated, it's historically accurate for this era, really tells you all you need to know about the necessity for the labor movement. The abuse and the exploitation were very real. But what's interesting is that even though Monicelli was a Marxist, and the film is certainly sympathetic to the plight of these workers, while portraying the factory managers as coldly manipulative and the owner as totally inhuman, the film somehow does not come across as leftist propaganda, the way Soviet films of the 1930s do, but rather as a rich historical document of the gestation years of the labor movement. And what's fascinating is the fact that, unlike the vast majority of historical films, The Organizer does not feel like a film of its era, of 1963 casting its light onto the 1890s. It actually feels like you're looking at a film made in the 1890s. And there are several factors that contribute to this rather stunning illusion. First of all, for the enormous factory shown in the film, it is not a set. Monicelli had the great good fortune to discover an actual 19th century textile factory that had been out of use for decades, but for some reason had never been torn down. So he and his team quickly got this old factory up and running. And you do get a tremendous feel for the actual texture, the day-to-day experience of these people who are just dwarfed by these massive roaring machines. And Monicelli also gives you a sense of the various forms of deprivation suffered by these people. Not just the hunger and the physical exhaustion and the miserable housing. They live in what are essentially glorified shacks with no real protection from the elements. But because of these crazy hours, the lack of any semblance of balance in their lives. But what's truly artful is the way in which these various deprivations are presented, which is generally not in a sentimental, tear-jerking way, which could quickly become tiresome and feel manipulative, but with a kind of world-weary dark humor. For example, one of the factory workers is a transplanted Sicilian who is looked down upon by his northern Italian peasant comrades, who at various times refer to him as an Arab, an Ethiopian, and a Bedouin. But he's the poorest of the poor. And in a scene early in the film, as the workers eat the lunch they brought outside the factory, this little Sicilian, while the others eat, he just stands there stone-faced with his back to a wall. He had no lunch to bring. And when the whistle blows to end the lunch period, one of the workers suddenly notices him and says, "Did you have enough time to eat?" And the Sicilian, instead of complaining or simply explaining his situation, just nods matter-of-factly, as if to say, yes, thank you. I did have enough time to eat. Absolutely nothing. And to add insult to injury, as the worker walks away from the Sicilian, he shakes his head and says to himself, "These cannibals wolf it down without even chewing." So the point is made, but with a certain rough humor. Now, another deprivation highlighted in the film, in a darkly humorous way, is illiteracy. The fact that the overwhelming majority of these workers cannot read or write, which is also historically accurate. So after the unfortunate elderly worker loses his hand in one of the machines, his comrades, as their opening gambit, decide to protest their 14-hour day by having one of them blow the factory whistle an hour early, at which point all of them will walk off the job en masse. So to choose who will blow the whistle, they decide to draw names out of a hat. But as the leader of this effort collects the names that the workers have carefully written down, he discovers that they've all written X because they can't read or write, so it becomes an impossible exercise. But as for the illusion that I mentioned, if there's one technical element that contributes most to this feeling that you're watching a film made in the 1890s, it's the photography by the great Giuseppe Rotunno, who, like Mastroianni on the acting front, demonstrates great range here, as his photography for this film is diametrically opposed to his work on another Italian film released the same year to much greater fanfare, The Leopard, which is photographed in exquisite, fully saturated color, while the image here is completely desaturated, high contrast black and white, with very flat lighting. And the American critic Dwight MacDonald made a very apt comparison of Rotunno's photography here to the work of Jacob Riis, last name spelled R-I-I-S, one of the most important photographers of the late 19th century. What Matthew Brady was to the Civil War, Riis was to the squalid conditions of 19th century urban life in this country. He really pioneered the brand new field of photojournalism and was closely linked with the reform-minded, muckraking investigative journalists of that era. One of his most famous books is called How the Other Half Lives, published in 1890. If you Google that title or enter it into Wikipedia, you'll see some of these incredible photographs, which had a major impact. Theodore Roosevelt had met Riis when Roosevelt was president of the New York Police Board, and he was a great appreciator of Riis's work, and the two men actually joined forces to create and pass early reform laws relating to housing and factory life in New York. But Ries's work definitely comes to mind when you look at Retorno's photography here, both in the quality of the image and the compositions. It's a very high level of artistry, as Retorno is able to find beauty even in the harshest settings and situations. A brawl, for example, between the strikers and a group of scabs or replacement workers who have been summoned by the factory's management and arrive in Turin by train. And during this brawl, a combination of deep fog and steam from the train creates this kind of dreamlike haze, with the combatants dropping in and out of view. It's very striking. He even manages to capture a kind of strange beauty in the shots within the factory, this geometrical jungle with these terrible cacophonous machines. And working hand in hand with the photography are the costumes. They don't look like costumes at all. They look appropriately worn down and lived in. Even the large mustaches, worn by most of the men in the film, serve to effectively evoke the period. Now, I mentioned nuanced characterizations in the screenplay earlier, and what separates this film from so many others, not just historical films but any genre, is that Monicelli and his co-writers took the time to compose little scenes, little exchanges, which illuminate these characters and bring them to life, so that we get to know them and care about what happens to them. And what's truly artful is that scenes and exchanges early in the film are recalled and cashed in on much later. Probably the most touching example of this technique is a pair of scenes, one midway through the film, the other at the very end, involving two young brothers, the older of whom, Omero, who looks about 16 or 17, works in the factory, and the younger, who looks about 10, is still in school. So just some background. One of the characters in this film is a socialist school teacher who solicits donations from his students, or from their parents really, to help out the striking workers. He also aids the cause in a more general way by giving free night classes where he tries to teach the adult workers to read and write. As this teacher says at one point, there were strict literacy requirements in Italy at that time. So to vote, you had to be able to read and write. And as a result, the vast majority were completely disenfranchised. But this teacher is constantly frustrated in his efforts. In the night classes, by the sheer exhaustion of his pupils, who arrive having worked these grueling 14-hour days and can barely keep their eyes open, and of course have had no time to study. And at his day school, he's constantly harassed by a busybody fellow teacher who informs on him. So midway through the film, this teacher, having just been reprimanded by the principal of his school for these allegedly subversive activities, is leaving the school as Omero, the teenage factory worker now on strike, arrives to pick up his younger brother. And he asks this teacher how his brother's doing. And the teacher responds, well, the boy isn't stupid, but he doesn't apply himself, and then just walks away, absorbed in his own difficulties. So we then follow Omero and his brother as they start to walk home. And just after they turn a corner, Omero suddenly flares up in anger, smacks his younger brother a few times, and yells at him that he must do better in school. He says, "You have to study, you have to graduate. I will kill you before I let you do what I did." And then, having made his point, Omero picks up the books that the boy has dropped during this exchange, carefully places his brother's cap back on his head, dries the boy's tears, blows his nose, and they walk on home together. So a harsh exchange for sure, but also touching, as it's clearly driven by brotherly love. But the real emotional payoff comes much later, in the final scene. As I said, the strike becomes increasingly costly, to both sides really, but mostly to the workers. Food, which the organizer had cleverly advised them to purchase on credit just before the strike, runs out. The factory owner enlists the police to harass the strikers. During that brawl that I mentioned, one of the workers is killed by an onrushing train, and so everyone just reaches a breaking point. But at a critical moment, as the strikers hold a meeting without the organizer present, where the majority agree to end the strike and return to their 14-hour days, the organizer, having been alerted to this capitulation, races to the meeting on his bicycle and proceeds to give a barn burner of a speech, telling the workers they should not cave, that he has information that the owners are about to cave, which, as we've seen, is true. And after reminding them of how little they're asking for, how badly they're being exploited, he leads the newly impassioned workers to storm the gates of the factory, which he tells them is rightfully theirs, since they're the ones doing all the work. But this storming of the gates, as it turns out, is one step too many, as disaster ensues. The police and the military get wind of this march. They meet the workers at the gates. The situation quickly spirals out of control. Shots are fired, and as the workers flee in panic, we see one of them left behind, lying dead on the ground, Homero. And after a long ensuing silence, Homero's sobbing older sister physically attacks the organizer, telling him it's all his fault, as the organizer, warding off her blows while stumbling around trying to find his glasses, which have fallen off in the melee, is finally led away by the authorities, and that's the last we see of him. Now, the payoff of that earlier scene outside the school comes in the very final shot of the film, as the workers, having failed to achieve their goal, arrive at the factory the morning after Homero's death for their 14-hour workday. And as they walk toward the camera, toward us, the last to arrive in the rear of the pack is Homero's 10-year-old brother in his little cap, there to take his older brother's place as the breadwinner of the family. And as the boy approaches us and finally moves out of the lower portion of the frame, the factory gate closes, the end. So masterfully set up by the earlier scene, and really just one of a number of scenes in this truly fine film that manages to simultaneously touch the heart and enlighten the mind. The film was generally well reviewed, at least here, but was not a big success at the box office, either in Italy or here. And part of that may be due to the not necessarily crowd-pleasing quality I mentioned earlier, this theme of collective failure and the lack of a happy ending. But another factor, at least in Italy, was political. At the time this film was released, there was a festering divide in that country between the far left, the communists, and the socialists, some of whom were trying to move toward the center. And it was assumed that with this film, which had its Italian premiere at the 35th Congress of the Italian Socialist Party, which in retrospect may not have been the best venue, it was mistakenly assumed that Monicelli was attempting some sort of commentary on this contemporary political situation, and had failed to do so effectively, which was of course a complete misinterpretation of his goals. And in addition, the more hardcore leftists, the communists, were also less than thrilled with Monicelli's portrayal of the workers and the organizer not as idealized leftist symbols, as they would be in a work of propaganda, but as, well, human beings with flaws. The workers, as I said, do display bigotry toward the Sicilian. They're constantly bickering, and although they do gather the courage to confront the factory management, they do so very hesitantly, almost apologetically, clearly intimidated. Which, why shouldn't they be? I mean, the management and the owners at that time had all the power, essentially the power of life and death. And the organizer, on top of this Chaplin-esque aspect that I mentioned, is also shown to be flawed, even borderline inhuman at times. For example, arriving at the funeral party for the man killed by the train, the organizer looks around and shouts out, "Why all the long faces?" It's pretty shocking, but with his almost total fixation on strategy and tactics, he can only see this tragic death, not as the loss of a human being, but as leverage to be used in the service of the cause. So his constant losing of his glasses may be symbolic of a greater blindness. But I think Monicelli makes a fair point there. To the political animal, especially the subversive political animal, crisis and disaster often represent opportunity. I mean, look how Lenin and his comrades used the disaster of the First World War as a golden opportunity to finalize their Russian Revolution, which was really more of a coup than a revolution, resulting from an alliance between Lenin's Bolsheviks and disaffected factions of the Russian military. Russian soldiers had no idea why they were fighting that war, and were more than happy to participate in a coup in exchange for a separate peace agreement, which was done the following year. But while the organizer in this film is insensitive at times, he doesn't exactly cut the Man of Steel type figure of a Lenin or a Stalin either. There's a wonderful scene, by the way, where this scruffy, famished organizer walks into this fine dining establishment and, looking for some loose change or maybe a piece of bread or something, stands there among these wealthy diners, takes out this little piccolo that he carries around with him, starts playing this operatic melody, and only manages a few bars before he's ejected from the premises. But none of these semi-comic scenes or character nuances sat well with the leftist ideologues in Italy, as such people tend to view films, really everything, not as an end, but as a means to an end, to a political result. And of course, right-wingers didn't exactly turn out in droves to see this film either, likely assuming, as I did, that a strike drama called The Comrades would be a piece of communist propaganda, and not the emotionally rich, humanistic, historically informed work that it actually is. And before I close, one last, I think, critical virtue of this film. You know, I was telling someone recently, I think we have a gratitude problem in this country, which to some extent dovetails with another important problem, a lack of historical awareness. And I do think this film serves as a necessary reminder that many of the things we take for granted, you know, unemployment insurance, overtime pay, worker safety regulations, child labor laws, you know, these things didn't just happen. And of course, they aren't universal even today. People with little or no resources fought for these things tooth and nail against ferocious opposition. And I understand that there is corruption in many unions and that that system is far from perfect. But Monicelli performs a real service here, I think, by showing us just how hard it was, at a time and place when the labor movement barely existed, to organize a collective effort of this nature without that pre-existing structure, at a time when a tiny elite, really, held all the cards and played those cards ruthlessly. So top marks to this one, really couldn't recommend it more highly. My 6th ranked film of 1963, The Organizer, which is available for streaming at the Criterion channel. Criterion also released it on DVD and Blu-ray, and as always, did a great job, although I could have used a few more extras. There's just a brief interview with Monicelli and that's it really, but the quality of the image is immaculate. Back in a moment. Your feedback is important to us. On Twitter, @Realtime1960s, on our Facebook page, or you can email the program, realtime1960s@gmail.com. Really, however you'd like to engage with us, we love engaging with you. And if you'd like to join our family and help us continue to bring you great content, please go to patreon.com/realtime1960s and subscribe. Don't forget to visit us at realtime1960s.com for our timeline, each and every podcast, links to social media, how to reach us directly, everything you need to know about this portal into the past that we are creating. Thanks so much for joining us, and stay tuned for the next installment of this ongoing series covering the top 10 films of 1963. So take care, and I'll see you soon.